Professor Carrara hopped up to a perch situated just behind the lectern to get a clear view of the audience. She stretched one wing and then the other before finally detaching her delicate arms from the wings and reaching forward, offering a gesture and a complex whistle that translated to the crowd as a welcoming greeting. She then continued in the more formal language favored in both academic and popular culture. I've been called here today to address some misunderstandings about Earth, a world recently admitted to the Galactic Union, and particularly about humans, the dominant species of that planet. I'm aware of how outlandish the stories you've probably heard sound. And before these ridiculous rumors begin to spread, it's my responsibility, as the leading expert on Earth and humans, to set the record straight. You've likely heard that, despite being sapient, humans somehow evolved on a Category 12 death world, and that they are stronger and tougher than one might reasonably expect for any sapient species. The crowd murmured anxiously, eager to understand how such a rumor had started. You've heard that because it is, in fact, literally true, Professor Carrara stated flatly. Earth has a punishing gravity of 9.8 ms2, so human musculature is adapted to that. The human endoskeleton has also adapted to be both hard and somewhat flexible, meaning most falls, even in that gravity, cause no skeletal damage to a human unless they are falling from a considerable height. Their vital organs are well protected by this endoskeleton, particularly the brain, which is completely encased in a thick, hard bone. In a fall, even one that breaks a bone, these vital organs are unlikely to be damaged. However, 9.8 ms2 gravity can't simply be ignored, so there is a height beyond which a fall would be fatal even for humans. Would anyone like to guess the limit? A few members of the audience signaled timidly, willing to take a guess. 4 meters suggested a bargain in the front row. Bargains, standing 2 meters tall, tend to cluster at a height around half the maximum distance of reasonably safe falls on their own worlds, so the idea of a fall from 4 meters at Earth's gravity seemed excessive. The professor smiled as a large display behind her lit up, showing 4 humans standing on a high ledge overlooking a rolling ocean, engaged in animated conversation. You'd think so, wouldn't you? She said mildly. Behind her, the humans on the cliff gave a shout in unison, ran, and dived off the ledge headfirst directly into the rolling sea. That's water, by the way, she explained. It has about the same mass density as humans do, so in terms of energy transfer, it's not all that much different from hitting solid ground. And I'd like to point out that the part of them that hits the water first is that same bony case I mentioned, which holds the brain. The bargain squirmed and spluttered. What in good God was chasing them? The professor trilled, and the translator rendered her response as one expressing anticipation. We'll get to that later, she said. Just remember, it genuinely is a Category 12 death world, and things may not be as they seem. Also, honestly, the predators in the water are even more dangerous than the ones on land. I also teach a regular class on Earth's wildlife, and rarely has the word wild been more appropriate. Behind her, the humans in the display had resurfaced, giving another shout and swimming toward the shore. Yes, she said, anticipating the next question, they took that landing without injury, and they can swim quite well actually for land animals. That fall you just saw is about the limit of what they can reliably survive with practice. Practice? Protested another being in the 5th row. What do you mean by practice? How do you practice something that will kill you if you haven't already mastered it? In this case, I think they start from lower altitudes, the professor replied. But in some other cases, there's really no accounting for how they can possibly become practiced in the things they do. As I was saying, however, there is no absolute limit, even on their high-gravity homeworld, to the height of falls they might survive. There are documented cases, though very rare, of humans falling from over 1,000 meters with no means of slowing down, save air resistance, and surviving. 1,000 meters. Spluttered the Ellie. They don't even have wings. How would they get 1,000 meters in the air? I'm glad you asked, said Carrara. Behind her, the display blinked again, showing a vintage small aircraft of about Tech Level 4 construction at considerable altitude. The crowd fell silent as an escape hatch opened in the side, and humans began jumping out one after another. They plummeted from the sky, eventually releasing brightly colored cloth parachutes that yanked with unbelievable force on harnesses they were wearing, causing several of those present to wince. These parachutes eventually dumped the humans, none too gently, on the ground, where they got up uninjured and started walking around. What happened to the vehicle? The Ellie asked. I mean, that's an insane emergency system, but I guess it worked. But why did they have to? We'll get to that, said Professor Carrara. I promise I'll give you something to think about. Just remember, it really is a Category 12 death world, and things may not be as they seem. But humans have a long history with vehicles. Honestly, I didn't know where to start here. They had ground vehicles pulled by large animals at Tech Level 1. Aren't all the large animals on Earth dangerous? Asked a small prionid at the back of the room. The professor shrugged. There are different kinds and degrees of danger, she said. The animals involved were horses. An image appeared on the display: large quadruped herbivores, herd animals, so not really a predation danger, but still. After another pause, the display settled on a pen of some kind. Suddenly a bell rang, a gate opened, and one of the animals they had just seen leapt out of the gate with a human clinging to its back, in scale with the human. It looked even bigger than it had seemed in the first image. The enormous animal reared and leapt, repeatedly coming down hard on its front feet, in a move clearly meant to dislodge predators from its back, but the human on its back, swinging wildly and coming down hard again and again. Held on like grim death oddly, one-handed, with the other hand waving in the air, perhaps for balance. Another bell rang, and the human nimbly jumped off onto the ground. The horse continued jumping and stomping for a few moments, then bolted for the far side of the pen. Now, there was considerable danger there, said the professor. The horse could have successfully thrown that human to the ground, where he could have been stomped or kicked, sustaining serious injury. This is how they take a wild horse and start to train it. You see these other horses here, standing quietly or responding to commands when there's someone on their backs? Those are trained for riding. But the prionid protested, riding animals is Tech Level 0. Humans are at least Tech Level 6, aren't they? This display has to have been recorded thousands of years ago. Actually, let me check, the professor replied. The lighted delays from the FTL relay hub, just 2 years ago, it's as recent as anything else we have from Earth. This activity happens on an ongoing basis. Why? The prionid continued. What forces a Tech 6 society to train and use riding animals? We'll get to that, Professor Carrara said. It's a death world. Surprise. But since we're on the topic of danger from animals, you should watch this next part. Behind her, the display showed another bell ringing, and an even more enormous creature leapt into the pen, with an even more tenacious, even more insane human clinging one-handed to its back, as the beast whipped its head back and forth, trying again and again to hook the human with its horns. It bellowed furiously, whirled, stomped, and shook, but the human on its back clung to it as the one they'd seen earlier had clung to the horse until the bell rang. He was catapulted from the beast's back when he let go and landed directly in front of it. The enormous animal charged, horns down, with the clear intent of killing him, when a second human, even crazier than the first, ran up and punched its flank. The animal was distracted for a moment, and the rider ran for the side of the pen. The insane human who had punched it was spinning a noisemaker and shouting at it, keeping it confused just long enough to set up his own escape. What was that? The prionid asked shakily. That was, let's see, a bull. Herbivore herd animal, like the horse. But this species has one breeding male per 30 or so females, and the bull's primary purpose is to protect his herd from, well, mostly other bulls, but also from predators. And it's a Category 12 death world. So of course it's equipped with formidable natural weapons in the form of horns. That guy there, like the humans, is every bit as tough as it has to be to survive there. And they're training those to ride? He spluttered. No, they've never ridden those, Professor Carrara said dismissively. They're far too slow. They raise that species mainly for food. Food? The prionid exclaimed. Yes, the humans routinely kill and eat them, Carrara confirmed. Then why? You're going to tell us why eventually, aren't you? Death world surprise? The professor nodded. You're wise to my little game, she said brightly. Before we go on, I want to illustrate the value of what humans call muscle memory. To some extent, every species does this, but with humans it's pretty special. They can master complex skills of movement and balance with just a few practice sessions, and if they continue to practice, they can learn to do things most species simply can't do. Behind her on the display, a human with blades strapped to its feet glided across a white surface. That's water ice, by the way, Professor Carrara said. So the temperature here is below the freezing point of water, said a Hanto, peering out from under his crest plates. How can this furless creature wear that and not die? Humans, Professor Carrara explained, are well adapted for temperatures between 15 and 35 degc, but can withstand temperatures down to 1 degc for as long as they remain active, or 40 degc with relatively simple protective gear. That human there is entirely comfortable skimpy outfit aside as long as it continues to burn through calories at this ferocious rate. But what I wanted to point out here is that this human is a dancer. Watch the graceful fluidity of movement in a mode of locomotion completely unlike their default. From watching this, you'd swear that this was the natural mode of locomotion for the species. It's not. Not even close. What that is human muscle memory at work. In the display behind her, the human leapt into the air in a blur of complicated movement and landed back on the ice, continuing as though nothing strange had just happened. They call that a triple axel, said the professor. I have no idea why and don't care. It seems like it really ought to be impossible, but you needed to see this in order to understand this next thing. Behind her, the display blinked again. On another frozen pool, about 40 humans wearing armor made of pads and carrying bent sticks slid on blades across the ice in the same way as the one they had just seen. Half were wearing orange clothing, and half were wearing white. This, Professor Carrara said, is a form of ritualized combat called hockey. As you may have heard, it was the misfortune of the hunters to begin their attempted invasion of Earth at an arena where hockey was in progress. They found themselves on slippery footing in the middle of 40 armed and armored humans, who were capable of entirely sure-footed movement on the ice, and who were there for combat. And the arena itself was entirely surrounded by several thousand more humans, present to observe the hockey. Humans weren't well known at the time, and the hunters didn't realize what kind of mistake they were making. Their vanguard force was quickly destroyed. But I want you to observe just for a minute or two how hockey progresses normally when there aren't any suicidal hunters on the ice. The bent sticks had seemed like awkward, unbalanced weapons, but in another testament to human muscle memory, the warriors on the field used them ferociously, brutally, and effectively. There was another weapon on the ice, which most of the audience hadn't at first seen, a sort of sliding missile that they could use the sticks to launch at each other. But there were 40 fighters on the field and only one missile, so using it would be tricky. The point of the contest seemed to be using that missile to strike the member of the opposing team, who stood at each end of the arena, but these two were the most heavily armored of all. Behind each of these designated living targets was a net, probably there to protect the audience from being hit by any shots that missed. After several clashes and crashes that ought to have killed them outright or reduced them to a heap of broken bones and torn flesh, Professor Carrara winced and said, "That's enough." The point of this faithful record of normal, uninterrupted hockey is that the Hunter Vanguard Force wouldn't have been much more likely to survive if they had treated the arena the same way humans do and abided by the rules and forms of the contest already in progress. You should know that this type of ritualized combat is important in human society. It takes place in several different varieties at different locations. This is football, that's what they call it. Behind her, the display brought up another arena, another set of warriors, a different shared weapon. All the colors and many of the shapes and details were different, but the basic design of the field looked a little bit like the same thing they had just seen, and this. This is also called football, but it's not very similar. The display briefly showed a green field with white parallel stripes, where massive, heavily armored humans clashed and inflicted horrible physical violence on one another for just a few seconds before Professor Carrara grimaced and turned it off. She had seemed to enjoy herself until the combat activities came up, but now she looked a bit ill. "What does this combat signify?" asked an ancient quadrupedal being on the right side. "I understand ritual combat. If all reasoning and negotiation fail, it is still far preferable to resolve large conflicts with small fights than to send people wholesale into an all-out universal war. To risk a few champions instead of sending half a generation to its end. But what kind of important conflicts are these champions resolving? And on whose behalf?" Professor Carrara looked up and said, "You'll be amazed. It's the same answer as all the rest. But I just want to visit a few more things before I put them all into context. Now, moving on, Marathon." Behind her, the display lit up with a view of a tiny coastal town. This, as far as we know, is what the human city of Marathon looked like about 3,000 years ago. There's a story about a fight that took place there around that time and how, just before the fight, one of the soldiers ran 42 kilometers to call in reinforcements and then ran back in time to join the fight. The display pulled back to an orbital view, and the path from Marathon to another human city was lit by a red trace. "Wait, ran how far?" asked the quadrupedal being who had spoken before. "Humans are descended from highly specialized pursuit predators," Carrara explained. "That means their basic hunting strategy, pre-civilization, was to run after prey faster than themselves until it fell over dead from exhaustion. And to varying degrees, humans retain that ability or can rekindle it with a few months of physical training. Once a year or so, most human cities organize a marathon, run a race of that 42-kilometer distance. On the display behind her, the globe spun. Seasons flew by, cities were built, canals were dug. And then the telltale electric lights of modern cities began to spread. There were now hundreds of paths outlined, each the same length as the path they'd seen before. And who runs these races? The other asked suspiciously. Convicts? Prisoners? A lot of people, actually. The display flashed an image with thousands of humans. This is the marathon run in a city called Boston. The quadruped stared as the image began to move, and he saw that this entire crowd was maintaining a brisk pace, a steady jog that gave him nightmares as a herd herbivore. Pursuit predators were his people's special nemesis. Here were thousands of them, and they could all run impossible distances. More and more runners kept pouring around corners and into the street as the camera lost track of the ones that had been in view at the start. There was no one place from which the whole group could be seen. Carrara explained, if you want some idea of how many humans were in the race, we'll need to look at the view from about a dozen different vantage points. The quadrupedal being shrank slowly to the floor and was silent. Professor Carrara sighed and told the room, but this entire tradition is actually based on a version of the story that someone garbled or got wrong. That messenger actually ran 240 kilometers each way, not 42. Behind her, the globe spun again, modern lights fading, and the view came to rest on the ancient city of Marathon once again. Now a different path was indicated, connecting Marathon to a different and more distant destination. The quadruped shrank in on himself and let out a small keening sound. The translators remained silent, no translation was needed. Now Carrara continued, some of you may have heard that humans breathe fire. If she had led with that, she knew she'd have gotten laughter. Now with what they'd seen, there was stony, wary silence. Behind her, the display lit up with images of a human in a ring, dancing, juggling a pair of torches. From time to time it brought one of them to its mouth, spraying a huge gout of fire into the air, and continued its mesmerizing dance. There were other humans around it, watching, laughing. So that's a half-truth, she said. Humans do not exhale any combustible gases or liquids save those which they have in their mouth when they start, if you watch this performer. You will note that it takes a sip from that container at the side of the walkway every so often. That's the flammable substance that this act is predicated on. But here is a strange thing, this act is about doing something dangerous, breathing fire, but the performer is faking that. The performer is faking that by doing something even more dangerous, drinking poison. Professor Carrara shrugged. I suppose the fire is more colorful and gets more attention, but that little container there is full of gasoline. I need to explain about gasoline. Very few planets have the geological processes necessary for its production. A very long time ago, plants grew on Earth and happened to be buried instead of composting normally in the ecological cycle. And having been buried, they were slowly buried deeper and deeper as geological strata built up. 30 million years later, by the time humans evolved, immense pressure, unimaginable heat, and exposure to mineral substrates had turned those buried plants into toxic, carbon-heavy sludge. The humans dug up this toxic sludge, refined it into gasoline, and used it for fuel. While they were at tech level 3, most of their water, air, and ground vehicles were powered by burning it. That seems ill-advised, said a small voice on the right. Craning her neck, she saw a small hexapodal creature with 3 arms and several eye stalks. She nodded. It was, but that's how they got through tech level 3. And it's not even close to being the most ill-advised thing they've done. For example, we haven't talked about the deliberate detonation of nuclear bombs on the surface of their homeworld. This last drew an assortment of sharp, shocked noises from the audience, but Professor Carrara ignored them and moved on. Anyway, this performer here is taking gasoline into its mouth and spraying it out past the torches. It has to be very careful because gasoline is, as I've already said, poisonous if swallowed, flammable in open air, and explosive in enclosed places. She paused. And its mouth is an enclosed place. Several of these performers die each year. Who is forcing them to perform such an act? Whispered the hexapod, outraged. At this point, the professor hopped from her dignified perch up onto the top of the lectern, where she could see and be seen by everyone. This was the most important part of the presentation. Nobody, she said. That's the answer to all of this. That's our Death World surprise. These are all recreational activities. They do these incredible things that others might be driven to in extreme desperation just because they want to. And these things you've seen aren't even half of 1% of the examples I've collected. Stunned silence filled the room. Carrara went on. Nothing chased those four off the cliff into the ocean. They just jumped because they wanted to. That aircraft hadn't had a catastrophic failure and wasn't about to crash. They just jumped out of it because they wanted to. In fact, humans pay money for people to take them up in aircraft, just so they can jump out in midair. Nobody's forcing these people into ritual combat, and there are no important conflicts being resolved. They just fight because they want to. Nobody's forcing this performer to do this insanely dangerous thing it just wanted to. That business with the horse and the bull and Tech Zero riding in a Tech 6 culture, they do all that just because they want to. All of the things you have seen humans doing here today are real, and they're not just one-time freak events. These things take place routinely on Earth, and all of them are recreational activities. This is how humans play. This is what humans do when they are in a happy, relaxed mood. And now maybe you can understand why we don't really want humans in an angry mood. So when you meet them, be careful. Don't make them angry. But even if they're not angry, even if they like you, remember that they may invite you to join them in something fun, without realizing that for you, it would be lethal. If they treat you as they would one of their own, normally a good standard for non-aggression, you'll probably die. She looked around, seeing comprehension dawning on a dozen different kinds of faces and failing to dawn on just as many. If there's any chance you'll be interacting with these creatures, this is a very important principle that you must grasp. And for the sake of your own safety, and that of everyone around you. I'll be continuing this discussion tomorrow, she said. And the first lecture of a class on Earth wildlife begins this evening, so please come if you're allowed. Several of your governments have indicated that study of that particular topic may require you to have a security clearance, so check with your embassies first. The stunned silence Professor Carrara had interrupted resumed, and then stretched out for another minute or so before the students slowly began to rise and file out. Editors note the story above features humans doing a lot of very risky things, which humans, after all, do. I am not urging readers to follow these examples. In particular, the fire breather described above is doing it in the most dangerous way possible. Using gasoline is insanely risky, even for a fire breather. Those interested in fire breathing as a sport should not follow the example of an idiot who uses gasoline, although there are many idiots who do. It is a reliable way to sooner or later achieve a very painful death. The use of kerosene is a far less reliable way to achieve a painful death, as it is non-explosive, burns at a lower temperature, and is far less toxic. But seriously, if you intend to take up fire breathing, you shouldn't be doing it based on something you read on the internet, particularly not a story that marvels at the insanity of the risks humans take. To minimize the odds of getting killed by your new hobby, you should go to a real instructor and pay close attention to the lessons,